Welcome to Watercolours with Caroline. This is the third lesson in Art Around the World, and this is based on a iStock photo that I purchased from iStock.com, and it's of the Devil's Marbles in the Northern Territories of Australia. So it's going to be some very lovely complementary colours, blue and orange. So get some paints ready and some paper, and we'll get started. Well, for the start of the lesson today, because we're going to be using a lot of orange in this composition, we're going to talk about what oranges you may have in your collection, in your palette, and how to mix some oranges. So I'm going to go through what I've got. You don't have to have the same ones, but if you've got them, you can test them out. And probably the most common orange is cadmium orange. It's quite opaque, but beautifully bright. I'm going to put it on full strength there and just take it down with some water so that you can see it when it's diluted and full strength. I don't use it very often, mostly because I'm not that fond of opaque colors, but it's still a really good, useful orange. The second one I have is Transparent Orange by Core Paints, quite on the red side compared to the cadmium orange, but beautifully transparent. It tends to push all other colors out of the way. If you put it with another color, it will take over and push that color away. I think you saw that on the first week when we did the African sunsets. So I put some cadmium orange on it, just took over the paper. A transparent orange, rather. Sorry. A yellow, which is close to orange, is gamboge. It's probably your most orangey yellow and a rather beautiful color. And if you don't have gamboge, you can add a little bit of red, nice bright red, cadmium red, say, to your cadmium yellow or your Hazel yellow, and you will get something very close to gamboge. Now, I use Hazel yellow from M. Graham, which could be similar to other yellows in other brands. They all vary a little bit. I just happen to really love this one. It's so beautiful. I'll bring that over here so you can see my palette. Beautiful, transparent, bright yellow. And I'm going to start by mixing that with a little bit of Permanent Rose. My Permanent Rose is Winsor & Newton. I'm going to put a little bit of Permanent Rose in there. The Permanent Rose is a very strong color. So I'm going to put a bit in, then add a bit more yellow to get an orange. And this is a very pretty orange, much more transparent than the cadmium orange. You can really see the texture of the paper through this. So if you want something that's not quite so opaque and in your face, that's a beautiful one. Probably the best one for this upcoming lesson is the Hazel yellow or your cadmium yellow and cadmium red. The two of them together just seem to make the best orange. And of course, you can make it more red, you can make it more yellow, depending on which pigment you use the most of. I've kind of done 50-50 here. I'm going to put it on full strength, and then I'll get a wet brush and I'll just dilute that out. So beautiful combination. You can see the red and the yellow are granulating a little bit in the paper there, which is also another really pretty thing that watercolors will do depending on the pigment. So let's try Hazel yellow with my Pyrrole red, which is a very strong red that I have. It's from M. Graham again. I really like the M. Graham paints. They're mixed with honey. They stay very moist, so you don't have trouble re-wetting. And the Pyrrole red is a beautiful, strong red. That makes a lovely orange too. Very, very similar to the cadmium red, Hazel yellow orange. So I'm going to put a little bit of Pyrrole red just here, just full strength. And above it, I'm going to put a little bit of the cadmium red, full strength. So you can just see cadmium red's a little bit more transparent, a little bit less intense. Permanent Rose is one of your cool ones, almost a pink. I like the Winsor & Newton ones, very beautiful color. I'll just put those different reds there. Now, lemon is a more opaque, lighter yellow, much cooler yellow. So I'm going to look for my lemon. I don't use lemon very often because the Hazel yellow seems to suit most situations. I'm going to mix it with some cadmium red. It will make a more opaque orange, but still pretty nice. All of these yellow and red mixes make pretty oranges that really, I've never thought about buying a tube of orange. I bought the cadmium orange just to test it out for class because I wanted to see what it was like. I don't really use it much. And the transparent orange from Core came in a tin of tester paints from Core that I was given as a gift. So I really love it, but it's a super, super strong color. So again, I don't use it very often. Hazel yellow and vermilion. Now vermilion, let's put a little bit here. Vermilion is a very orangey red already, so it's close to orange. And if I mix that vermilion with some hazel yellow, I will have rather a beautiful color again. You can just feel the heat from all these oranges here. Gorgeous. Oh, I have a little space just for vermilion here because it is a very orangey red, so you can use it if you want your oranges. My vermilion is by Holbein. Came with a test packet. So alizarin crimson, one of your very, very cool reds. And that can make probably going to make a more muddy one. So I got my hazel yellow and my alizarin crimson. Yeah, it's going to make a darker, more muddy orange, which is great if you want a darker, more sort of browny orange. Alizarin crimson does tend to turn sort of a browny pink. It's one of your cool ones. If you want a really bright orange, you want to stick with your warmer colors, your warm reds. And of course, your hazel yellow is pretty much neutral. It's right in there. Your gamboge is warm. The lemon is cooler, and hazel is what I would call a very neutral yellow. I'm going to mix it with quinacridone magenta, which is another core color that I got in that little tester pack, just to see what we get. We're going to get another sort of very brown, very browny orange, at least using the hazel yellow. And Rose Madder is trying to show you my mixing palette, but it's really difficult because I'm using a lot of wells here, and then I make a mess. So Rose Madder is a brownish, cool, pinky red. And you could mix, if you were doing a orange rose or a rose that had orange tinges to it, the Rose Madder here, that would be a rather lovely color. Some of these are more subtle. If you want a more subtle look to your mixing. Let's just move the camera up a little bit. So burnt sienna is an earth color, not really what you'd call an orange, but I have a Winsor & Newton professional grade paint, and I love it. It's clear and bright, and you can use it in place of an orange because it is so orangey for a brown, and it mixes so beautifully with your warm reds. I'm going to mix it with cadmium red so we can get a real reddy brown color, which we will use in this composition that we're going to be doing of Devil's Marbles in the Northern Territories of Australia. It's a sacred place for the Aboriginal people. It's a park and full of these wonderful granite and sandstone rocks that have, over time, with wear and tear from weather and earthquakes and everything else that happens to the landscape, they've cracked and lifted up and formed what looks like marbles of rock thrown all over the landscape in a very hot and dry climate, of course. So those are the oranges. The second thing that I would like to do, I'm going to try and take this gently off of this pad. So I've got my next page. The next page is mixing mixing your complementary colors. Now, your complementary colors for orange, of course, your complementary color is blue. And I would say the perfect complementary is the one we're using for the sky, which is phthalo blue, which is what this is the very similar blue that you get in your printer for your printer ink, because it does mix a beautiful range of colors. So when you mix, oops, I just put blue in my nice orange there. When you mix complementary colors, you get such a gorgeous range of muted colors. You'll get grays, you'll get greens, you'll get browns, you'll get all kinds of muted colors. And rather than use brown or gray to dull down a color, it's so much better to use its complementary. So we can either use a mixed orange, or we can use an orange straight out of the tube, just like cadmium orange or transparent orange. I'm not going to use the transparent orange because it doesn't get on well with a lot of the other colors. I am going to use my own mix, which my favorite is of all of those was the Hazel yellow with the cadmium red. I think that makes a really good, solid orange mix. And we're going to use that we're going to put that down first. Here we go. And then we're going to mix it with different blues. We'll start with ultramarine, a warm blue. And I want to put a little bit of ultramarine here, and then take a little bit of orange and just dull that orange down a tiny bit for my first little square. Now for each little square, I'm going to bring this over here just a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue each time. To be careful I don't add too much. So I'm not going to put it right in the orange to start with. I'm going to put it here. I'm going to add a little bit to the orange, maybe a little bit more. So it's just a little bit more blue. It's actually going very green because we have the yellow in there. And then a little bit more blue. And a little bit more blue, just a tiny bit at a time. What you're trying to do is get different grades of mix as you add a little bit more blue each time. To take it. And if you want to make your ultramarine blue less bright and intense, a wonderful way to do that is add some orange. And you can experiment with different oranges. We don't have time to experiment with them all today, so we're just going to do a few. But you could, if you wanted, on your own time, make a big chart of all your oranges and all your blues to see what a huge color range you could get. The other warm blue that I have is Cobalt Blue. I bring a little bit of Cobalt Blue over here. And again, I'm going to get a little bit of orange to mix with that. And just first of all, just with a little touch of blue, make sure my brush is fairly clean so I don't contaminate it too quickly. Now a little bit more Cobalt Blue. This is going a very soft olivey green, a little bit more. And if you wanted a really soft olivey green, this is a great, great mix. Cobalt Blue is a soft color. It's nowhere near as intense as ultramarine blue, but it is warm like ultramarine blue. So if you wanted to just take it down to not quite so blue, adding a tiny bit of orange would do that. Just messing with those two a little bit. I'm cleaning my palette as I go so that I can get really fresh color. So phthalo blue is a strong, intense, cool blue. Let's take some of that. I believe mine is Winsor & Newton. I've gone through a few of them, so I think that's what we've got here. It's going to really only take a tiny bit of the phthalo blue. I'm going to do the first one here. Going a very, very sort of nice bright green almost immediately. I'll get some more, a bit more orange mixed up. There we go, a bit more orange over here. Take some, and of course, depending on how much water you use, how much paint you use, it's all going to affect what your colors look like. And these here are making some really gorgeous greens. Now, if we were very, very disciplined, and I'm not going to be today, but if we were, you could use these three colors. You could use phthalo blue, azo yellow, and cadmium red to paint this whole picture we're going to paint, because you could mix browns with those colors, you can mix grays, you can mix oranges, you can use those colors for just about everything in this picture. But we're going to be a little bit more lazy and sort of get some of our colors just straight out of the palette, mainly to save a bit of time. Cerulean blue is another cool blue, very gentle, a bit more opaque. Cerulean is Latin for sky blue, and it's a great one to have in your palette for a quick sky. I'm going to take some orange and add a teeny bit of that cerulean blue. It's just going to dirty the orange up a little bit, and you should get some very, very gentle greens with this mix. Very, really pretty greens. Look at that one. That last one is really pretty. Prussian blue is a much darker, cool blue. Quite often, different manufacturers use different pigments to make their colors. Some of them use very similar ones because some are more common. So you have to look at the tube to find out what yours have in them. But sometimes Prussian may have phthalo blue and black to darken it, or they may use some other blue pigment. I'm not sure about mine, but phthalo blue is a very, very pretty dark blue color. So again, I'm going to take some of that orange and just a little touch of phthalo blue. Prussian blue. A bit more Prussian blue. I get muddled when I'm trying to paint, mix, and talk at the same time. My brain doesn't really cooperate too well. And then a lot of Prussian blue. Prussian blue plus a yellow makes a beautiful forest green. And adding a little bit of the red brings it down so that it's not quite so intense. And I'll demonstrate that on my other sheet here. I'm just going to move to my other sheet and mix the phthalo, I keep saying phthalo blue, Prussian blue. Let's get this over here so you can see. So Prussian blue with some azo yellow will mix a really lovely, lovely intense green. I'm just going to put that here. It's beautiful. And if you want some forest colors, that's a lovely one to pick. Of course, you can add more yellow to that. I've just added a bit more yellow and you get a much brighter green. But if those are too bright for you, you want some green in shadow, then you can add some red to that. So I've added some red, which is the combination that we've just been working with. Cadmium red, azo yellow, and Prussian blue, same combination I've just been working with. I've added some red, and we've got a gorgeous, gorgeous dark green. The Prussian blue will keep it fairly transparent, and the red will darken it up. Again, using complementaries rather than gray or brown. It gives you vibrant, translucent darks rather than muddy darks. That was just a little aside. Trying to get through these fairly quickly. We don't want this to be too long. You can slow it down if you're working with your colors. Indigo is quite often got black in, and it's a very, very dark blue, as you know, from like indigo denim. And a lot of manufacturers will put black in their pigment to mix that. I'll get up a little bit more orange going here. My water's getting a little tired of me. Right, it's got a bit more orange to go. So let's take a little bit of orange. I'm going to have over here a little bit of indigo. Just a little bit. It's again a cool dark blue, a little bit more indigo. This is not only a good color mixing exercise, it's a good discipline in how to add a little bit more pigment each time to change up your colors. So you can see it goes from a rusty orangey color to a dark greeny gray color, which is rather lovely. Payne's gray is not what you'd really call a blue, but quite often they do use ultramarine. My one has ultramarine blue in it. The pigments on the tube said ultramarine blue and black. So, and it's a cool color. Mine is a very cool Payne's gray. And again, I'm going to do this over here because they're dark colors and I don't want to get them overly mixed. I'm trying to show you what I've got over here. My first one is just a tiny little bit of Payne's gray, a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and a little bit more. Now, violet, again, is sort of not exactly blue, but it's a good color to try out with this complementary, because if I've mixed yellow in with my orange mix, violet is the complementary of yellow. So we've got some complements working for us here, and I think it's going to make some very pretty colors. So I'm using dioxazine violet because it's a beautiful, clear, strong violet. And again, I'm going to take some of my orange over here and mix a little bit of violet in with it, just to take the orange down one notch. A little bit more violet, 2 notches, a little bit more, 3 notches, a little bit more, 4 notches, and a little bit more, 5 notches. Now, if your violet is too strong for you in a painting, you can add a little bit of orange to gray it down a little bit. One last one I have here is my Cobot Teal, which is a very cool, very cool color. It's by Quor, came in that little tester packet. Not something I'd normally buy, but it's rather pretty. So I'm going to try that with a little bit of orange. And again, we should get some interesting soft greens by using this one. Oops, not enough blue in that one. And then a bit more blue. So really, really pretty soft greens. So look at that range of colors that we have. And that's just a small range from adding 2 complementaries together, just one simple orange I mixed and a variety of blues. So if you want to, in your own time, you could make a big chart and use all of your blues and all of your oranges and see how many beautiful colors you can mix. It's why we don't really need many colors to paint a picture, but sometimes it's quicker just to use a color straight from the palette rather than spend a lot of time mixing. So on to the next bit. We will be doing the composition next, now that you've had a little bit of warm up mixing your colors. And if you need to talk to me, just unmute yourself, that's fine. Yeah, so we're going to do exactly the same as last week, where we're going to wet the sky, and then we're going to put in a little bit of yellow where the tree is, and then the blue for the sky. So it's very similar to doing the palm tree last week, and it worked a little better on this one. I have a kind of a yellow glow behind the tree, which I quite like. My daughter liked it too. It's, you know, it's not distracting really. It doesn't really show up lots of light leaves, but it just gives a glow to the tree. And I think that worked just fine. We don't have to be so precise with watercolor. So what we do have to be when we're wetting the sky, we have to be careful not to wet the rocks by accident, because the rocks need to have a very crisp, hard edge. And if we wet the rock by accident, the blue is going to go into the rock and we're never going to get a lovely crisp orange or yellow to it. So when I wet, I don't wet right up to the edge of the rock. I just wet almost to the edge of the rock so that I don't have any overlap. And if I do, I try to disguise it a little bit. I'm going to get some clean water. And now I'm going to have to wet carefully. So I'm going to use my number 8 brush because I want to get the water on there, but I also have to be careful. I'm going to turn my paper because it's going to make it much easier for me to wet carefully along the edges of the rocks. And I don't have to be careful I do have to get my brush cleaner. You'd be amazed at how much yellow and orange I've got in that brush. Too much, really. So I don't have to be ultra careful in the sky up here. And I'm going to wet right over the tree because remember, I'm going to put that yellow glow behind the tree. And when I come up to the rocks, I'm not going to go right up to the edge. I'm going to leave a dry edge and I'll fill that in with paint when I do some painting. There is a tree here, so I can kind of come down here. I have to remember where everything is. And I can go right over my masking fluid, which is the beauty of masking fluid. I hate this stuff, but sometimes it just makes life a little bit easier. We fight all the time, masking fluid and I. Right. I'm just tipping my paper to make sure I've got it wet everywhere. I'm going to turn it back the right way. And while that's soaking in, I need to get some blue for the sky. I want a nice clean spot. So like I said, I'm going to start with a bit of an ultramarine at the top so I can get some ultramarine ready. I'm getting a little bit extra because I had to clean up some of the orange that I had on it. And I also want some phthalo blue. Phthalo blue is a pretty dangerous color. It's very intense, it stains, but I want an intense look to this painting. So we're going to have to be brave and make an effort to be as careful as we can. And I have taught to myself not to get the blue anywhere but in the sky where we want it. Now, I've given that water a little bit of time to soak in. I'm going to start, I have the paint on my number 8 brush. And again, I'm going to turn my paper so that I can paint easily. And I'm going to put that, it's a little bit too wet. So I'm just going to dab my brush, not my chalice, dab it off a little bit and not have the paint quite so wet. Otherwise it dilutes too much. Oh, you know what I forgot? Completely forgot. The tree. Slow down. I need to put a little bit of Hazel yellow, not very wet, otherwise it will flood everywhere. I want to put a little bit of Hazel yellow where the tree is. Everywhere that the tree is. I'm going to come back with green later. But I'm going to pop that in first, just like we did with the palm tree. Thank goodness I remembered that before I got much further. I'm going to switch to my number 6 brush. Wherever that's gone, I want a bit more control. Wetting your paper gives you time to work on all of these things too. It's great. Got my ultramarine blue at the top. Now I'm going to load up my brush with the phthalo blue and go from one side to the next. I don't paint over that yellow. I just go up to the edge of it, just up to the edge. Remember, have your blue the same consistency as your yellow, and then they just should sit right next to each other. I'm going to come down close to these rocks, just the edge of that tree. I can go this side just to the edge of the tree. Now, when I get to the edge of these rocks, the edge is dry, so I can be very careful with the point of my brush as I go around the rocks. The tree trunk has masking fluid on, so I don't have to worry too much about that. A bit more paint. Oh, sorry, I'm focusing what I'm doing and you can't see, and I've got a great big hair just stuck in there for unknown reasons. There we go. Now pull this over here, and a big dry patch in where I wetted there, which I didn't even notice. Now I don't usually paint in this direction, but I want the camera to be able to see what I'm doing, so I'm having to turn it, so it's a little bit difficult for me to paint. But what I want to do is the edges around these rocks, are dry. I didn't wet right up to the edge. So with the tip of my brush, I am very, very carefully going around the edges of those rocks so that they are sharp, so that they really stand out. I have to turn it. I'm sorry, I've got to turn it to get my hand around there. I want the edges to stand out against the sky, nice and crisp. And because my sky is wet, the paint should just flow into the wet sky. If your paint's not flowing into your wet sky, you didn't wet it enough. You need to have wetted it more. And I'm carefully going around these rocks. I'm not forgetting there's a tree here that I have to come up against carefully. And then there is going to be a tree here too, but I'm sort of going to just worry about that later. This part, you have to really, really be careful that you get into the right spots with your color. If you don't, you're going to have to just invent a rock that's not in the reference photo. Nobody's ever going to know that. You're allowed to invent rocks if you make a mistake. Now I do have masking fluid there, and I can use the white paint afterwards if I need to. I'm just going to double check my reference photo to see where the tree comes in these rocks. Now what I'm going to do, because it's wet right now, I'm going to mix some of that blue and some of my yellow, and I'm actually going to take that tree color in there. There's some tree here, and I'm going to put a bit of that, a bit more yellow. This tree sort of just about here. I can put a little bit of that in right now. This sort of bushes, just so that I get that ragged edge against the rock where the tree is. A little bit more yellow, and just touch a little bit of yellow in there. While this blue's still wet, I can just tip that yellow in there to get a brighter edge to that tree. I didn't do this last time. I'm just inventing a new way to do this. Every time I do something, I sort of think about a different way that I could do something. And I'll show you the tree that I mean. Right here, in between these rocks is a very bushy tree. Don't even know what type of tree that is. I've actually, on the first one, I did put these two little trees in here. I left them out. I found them way too distracting and difficult to do, so I just completely left them out of the second and third compositions. I think it works better without them. So now this has to dry before we can do much else, but we can do a little bit of this sandy earth that's sort of down here. We can put the first layer on here. And of course, we'll be adding more layers of sort of red earth and brown and so forth. But just remember, all of this here through here is a very, very light sandy color. So our first sort of layer for this is going to be a very light sandy color. We don't want to go too dark with the first layer. Now, so you use diluted raw sienna and then a little azo yellow and a little cadmium red in the foreground, and burnt sienna. Burnt sienna is one of the orangey browns that I didn't use on the chart before, but definitely it can come under the umbrella of orange, especially mine. I'm just going to go back to my orange chart. I like the Winsor and Newton. I like the Winsor and Newton burnt sienna the best. It is a really orangey burnt sienna, and I just think it's cleaner, clearer, more beautiful than some of the other burnt siennas. I've tried quite a few, and it has that lovely orangey tinge to it. And the Winsor & Newton one, whatever they've put in it is much more transparent, much easier to blend. And I really like that brand of burnt sienna. So that is sort of on your brown orange end of the spectrum, but you can definitely use it as an orange. So we can't touch any of the wet blue paint, but we can get some. I'm going to bring my palette over here. I want some diluted raw sienna. Mine's an M. Graham raw sienna, diluted. I mean, you're going to really add some water to it, so it's going to stain your paper rather than paint it to start with. I'm going to add to that some azo yellow, not to it actually, not mixed with it, but when I'm painting, I will put some next to it or on top of it. A little bit more. And the third color is some cadmium red, or whatever bright red you have. You might have quinacridone red, Perol red, you might have Vermilion, that's quite a good one. Any nice bright red is going to work. And I love to have at all times my reference photo right there so I can see exactly what I want to achieve without get clean water, without guessing. And what I want to achieve is very, very light, very, very light all through the middle here. There's sort of very light grass through here. That's just that very diluted raw sienna. Take it through here behind the tree. And it's kind of more of a bright yellow behind the tree here. So I'm going to add a little bit of the azo yellow in here. I'm going to kind of flick it upwards with my brush because there is grass coming up here. We'll put a lot of the extra.
Are you on?
The only thing that I wet was the sky. So I'm making sure that this is dry. It gives me a little bit more working wet in wet, because I've got very diluted colors. If it was wet, my diluted colors may just all blend into almost nothing. So I want to have, you could work on wet. It just makes it a little bit easier to control on dry. So I want to take that raw sienna down here, but I'm going to add some, I've got some of that cadmium red, and while that's still wet, and some of the yellow, I'm going to add the red and the yellow wet in wet along here for that kind of orangey sand color. And off to this side. Now this is our first layer. This is just, it's like an underlayer. So you don't have to worry too much about detail with the underlayer. I got some yellow on my brush. I want to get a bit more yellow in here. Wet in wet. You can have all different colors, warm colors, to the yellow, the red. I'm going to take a little bit of burnt sienna now. And on this corner, there's quite a lot of dark in this corner. So with the burnt sienna, with the wet and wet, I can put, my burnt sienna is very dry. I don't have much liquid with it, so that all of the rest of this is wet, and it won't flood too badly if I put a fairly dry burnt sienna on there. You know, I put a wet brush into it, and that's pretty much it. And if this tree trunk is going to sit in the grass, I need some dark behind that. Take some burnt sienna along here. Now we definitely can't put all the darks in at this stage. It's not possible, but we can definitely just put a foundation for what's going to come next. This foreground rock here, I can put in the raw sienna, and then I can suck a little bit back with my brush. more yellow here. And at any time while this is wet, I can suck a little bit of color up with my brush if I need to. Now, I don't want to do too much more, because if I touch that blue sky with this earth color, we're going to get a mixing that I don't actually want in this painting. Be fine in some other painting, but I want that really crisp, dry border between the orangey rocks and the blue sky. My blue sky has not gone as bright as this one, but that's okay. Everyone's going to be different. If you want yours a little bit darker, add just a little bit more pigment to your paint. Now I'm going to pause because I'm going to have to use the hairdryer. So I'm going to pause for a second to remember all these things. The next step is to paint the rocks. Now the paper's completely dry. We can put the rocks in without danger of bleeding into the sky, but we still have to be careful around those edges. And I have put a little bit of masking fluid on the lightest parts of these rocks. Now you can either do that, or you can put some white on later, or just suck the paint up with a thirsty brush as you go along. What we want to put on these background rocks, we're going to do them in 3 layers. We're going to put the very lightest layer on first, which is going to be raw sienna with a tiny bit of yellow mixed in with it. So I've got my palette here, and I still have some raw sienna. So let's get a little bit more. And I'm going to just add a little bit of yellow to that to brighten it up. A couple of touches of yellow, a bit of water. And it doesn't matter how light you go with this layer, because you can add more color. Don't go too dark, because you're going to find it difficult to take color away. I want to go to my number 6 or number 4 brush. I'm going to try my number 6 and get some of that color. I'm going to wet my brush, so I still can bring this over here a little bit. Let's pop that there so you can see it. I'm going to load my brush with this color. This is my number 6 brush. And now very carefully, I'm going to paint these rocks. I'm going to start over here to see what my color is like, just to get an idea. And it looks okay to me. These 2 colors should lift fairly well with a thirsty brush. And at the moment, I'm not worrying too much about the definition between the rocks, because that can all come with the next layer. I'm going to put this first light layer in. Now the reason I put some azo yellow into the raw sienna mix was to warm it up. These are really bright, hot looking rocks, and I'm just put a little bit more azo yellow in there. We really want them to glow in this landscape. So now you'll notice I put strong color on at the more shaded end of the rock here, and as I got to this part of the rock, I'm less paint. I'm drying. I've got a towel here, drying my brush a little bit so I don't have so much paint. I can even use a thirsty brush, which is a clean, almost dry brush, to pull a little bit back if I want to. And like I said, I'm not going to bother about definition at this point. I did miss here. There's a little bit of blue sky between those rocks. I can put that in after the yellow's dry. I should have maybe put it in when I was doing the sky. I'm coming up behind that tree. Now the thing with all painting, watercolor or any painting, is your first layers are your big shapes, and you just kind of like get everything in. If you're doing oil or acrylic, it's your big dark shapes you put in. If you're doing watercolor, it's all your light shapes you put in, and you go big shapes to start with, and then you gradually add layers of more shade, more color. Now I'm putting a little bit more color down in the grass there. I want to blend the 2 a bit, and take my thirsty brush and kind of just blend the line between them. I have a little bit of blue and yellow over here from earlier. I'm just going to put a touch of that along here, along the edge, because there is very dry grass there. It's not that bright, but I'm going to put dark over the top, so it doesn't matter. Again, a little bit of a wet brush, and I'm agitating that in the border between the land and the rocks. And I have the raw sienna and yellow on my brush, so I think I'm going to put a little bit more on this rock here. Some rocks in the distance. And I'm going to add to this foreground with a bit more of that raw sienna and yellow mix. Adding it in here, giving another layer of color to the foreground. Now, if you always make your brush strokes doing these kinds of things horizontal, it's going to make everything lay down flat in your landscape. If you go in the other direction with your brush strokes, it won't. You might want to go the other direction for grass and so forth, but if you want your landscape to lay flat, you need to keep your brush strokes going in a horizontal direction. Otherwise, it just won't sit down flat for you. Now, this tree here is dry, and I want my rocks to dry before the next layer. So I can go in with my second layer on this tree to put the second layer of green in. Now let's have a look at the reference photo. If you isolate some of these colors that are in this tree, they are extremely similar to these red colors in the rocks if you look carefully at them. Yes, there's some greens in there, but isolate this area here, and you almost have some of these like golden colors from the rocks. So we want to put some of those golden colors in as our second layer before we put in the dark green layers. So I've used, for mine, I've used Hazel yellow plus the green plus the cadmium red. And I can use any of the sort of golden colors to put those colors in, like burnt sienna. We can mix a variety. I'm going to take some burnt sienna and some cadmium red and some Hazel yellow. Getting a little strong there. I'll take it down a bit. And I have a sap green here I can add to that. So I've got kind of a reddish golden green color. And you could probably add ultramarine blue to that. Remember all those colors we just mixed? And I want to water that down. I don't want to go too strong with this, to go to a slightly smaller brush. That's my number 4. And I'm going to just try that out here. Some little like dots of color. I'm actually going to put a bit more red in that, a bit more yellow in that, and a bit more raw sienna in that. And add those in. Now I don't want to lose some of my yellows, so I'm sort of dotting it in and splodging it in. Some places it's splodged, some places it's dotted. And I'm going to go into, I have some Hazel yellow right here. Add a little bit of that browny color to it, a bit of red to it. Very, very light mix here, and put some much lighter areas on the tree. Now these are little tiny leaves on this tree, so I don't want to make big marks. Keep it fairly open. I'm going to add a little bit more red to that mix I just made. And up here, we've got some very warm colors showing. And down here. The thing is, we're going to echo, these warm colors going to echo in the rocks, and we can do these wet in wet with the green. I can mix any green in with that to get a darker green. I could use sap, I can use phthalo green, I can use phthalo blue. I'm just taking it down to a more greeny color. I added everything in that sap, phthalo. I think in my notes I said you can add phthalo green, azo yellow. All of them will make a lovely green. Or if you've used phthalo blue already in your picture, you can use phthalo blue with the azo yellow. You take it with the red, it'll take it down so it's not so bright. And while this is still wet, we can go in and we can add the darker areas of the leaves. I've just got my number 4 brush, just the point of the brush. And I'm adding in the darker greens. I might add a little bit more yellow to that on one corner, just to have some lighter greens in there too. And remember, you can still leave some of that yellow showing. And they definitely don't need to connect all of the leaves on this tree. I've added even more yellow to the corner because down here I want to have it brighter in the sunlight and much lighter here in the sunlight. Don't forget the contrasts of light and dark are really important in your painting. And the nice thing is, while our rocks are drying, we can work on this tree, putting in the leaves just carefully and slowly. We don't have to slap them in there quickly. We can work around the tree, think about what we're seeing. Look at the reference picture if you have it. And I'm looking at mine thinking I can see quite a few more warm patches over here. So I'm going to put in a few more, and over here I'm going to put a few more down here. Red and green are complement. You've got your complements of orange and blue, but red and green are complements. So if you add a little bit more cadmium red to that warm color and put it next to the green, again, they will sing. It just makes a color sing to have something complementary next to it. And you may think it really, really odd to put red or orange in the tree, but when you've put the green up against it, and if you feel on your next layer you need even more green, it'll work for you. It'll work just fine. I'm carefully looking at the reference, making sure I build my tree out slowly so that I've got everything in the right place. It doesn't have to be exactly like the reference photo, but it sure helps if it resembles it. It just helps you put it together. There's a little clump of leaves coming out here and hanging down. It's kind of nice little shapes to the edge of the tree. Once you've got kind of the mass of the tree in, you can use the point of your brush to add a few more of these leaves that come out a bit more from the tree. And you can also add the darks a little bit more. It's nice if they come, you know, around the trunk and the branches. I'm trying to search for a word. Also, I've got this sort of bush behind the rocks that I put in with a little bit of paint. Well, I want to mix some yellow with that green to make the outside of, it's not light enough, a bit more yellow with that green. Amazing how much yellow you have to mix with green to get a light green. I want some of this to be more defined, this tree over here. So I'm getting the light green on my brush, and then I'll get some of that dark green, add a little bit of ultramarine to it, darken it up a little bit, and put the darker areas in, just wet in wet, to give this a little bit more definition behind the rocks here. And of course, right now it really stands out because the rocks are too light. but we don't have to worry too much about that as we get into the painting more. Now, a lot of the growth over here, the grass, is an extremely brownish green color. So we can mix that with any of our colors that we tried out in our mixing process. I've got my ultramarine blue, maybe a little bit of my phthalo blue, and then I'm going to use my orange that I mixed, which was azo yellow and cadmium red. And we're going to make some of those brown, very browny greens, very warm, extremely warm greens to do the grasses and so forth that are sort of around here. Now I want to strengthen the foreground before I do that. So I'm going to wet the foreground so I can get the colors to mix wet in wet. There's sort of a very sandy path that goes through here. And I want to clean this up because I want a nice orange in here. Get that clean. And I want to have my azo yellow and cadmium red orange here. A bit more cadmium red. And then my azo yellow and raw sienna color. I'm going to bring my azo yellow and raw sienna color stronger now in through here. I don't want them strong back here, so I'm going to suck those up with my thirsty brush. And I'm going to take that warmer orange that I made and put that really in the foreground here. And I'm using my thirsty brush to just blend that in. Take a little bit of cadmium red and add a bit more cadmium red just here. It'll fade, it looks bright right now, but it will fade in, don't you worry. Plus all our rocks are going to be really bright. I'll put those in. Now I have that little bit of sky there. I can get my tiny brush, little number 2 brush, and my phthalo blue. And I'm going to have to very, very carefully put that little bit of sky in here with my tiny, tiny brush that I missed my first go round. It will look bright till it dries. I'll pop that in there between those rocks. I have my tiny, tiny brush in my hand. So I want to get some of that very browny green. And I want to do some grasses from the corners here. And under the tree, I'm going to go like horizontal first for shadows, and then lift that up a bit with my brush to put in all this kind of grass that's around the tree. I'm going to add some burnt sienna to that mix just to brown it up a little bit more. There's some quite browny areas here and some horizontal strokes. Again, put the horizontal in to get the ground lying flat, and then you can go in with your grass, pulling it up with the point of your brush. A little bit more burnt sienna and add a little bit of ultramarine blue. Oops, a lot too much ultramarine blue. A bit more burnt sienna. Going to get some really nice dark browns for this area and just here. So we have a really nice contrast, especially close to the edge and the dark tree. And some corners, you always want to have some dark at the corners. I'm getting some more red with my orange and just putting that wet in wet beside some of that grass I've just put in, sliding in some red here, back into my greeny brown color while that red's wet, and adding a little bit more grass. It's a really back and forth thing with wet in wet. And again, I've got that red, pop it in here. And slowly, a little bit at a time. There's got a lot more dark shadow we're going to put in here after this is dry. There's also, just coming along here, I've gone back to that green, more greeny brown. On the edge of this brown, I've got the more greeny brown. And I'm going along here. And that area is wet here, so it's going to flood up. I'm going to have a bit of a area here where there's grass. My very thin rigger brush. And I can pull up some even thinner grass with that. It's quite messy brush and grass here, so you don't have to be all going in one direction or very clean and tidy. And slowly, a little bit at a time, a little bit here, a little bit there. You'll probably even find that as your tree starts to dry, you might want to go in later with some darker greens just for emphasis, but it needs to be dry first. So you've got to make sure that's dry. I'm just going to test the rocks here. And I think pretty sure they're all dry enough, ready for the next layer of color. I'm just going to check my notes. I have my notes here. So, it says here, when the first layer on the rocks is dry, add some more dry brush shading with an orange mix, Hazel yellow plus cadmium red, or gamboge plus red, or any oranges that you have. And then your third layer, you can add some burnt sienna and red, or red iron oxide is another really lovely color. So we're going to go into the second layer on your rocks, which is your orange mix, or your orange that you like from your palette. Now, my orange mix that I like is the Hazel yellow and the cadmium red. So I'm going to stick with that and make some more. And I've got to make sure that I'm doing now dry brush on these rocks. I want a lot of control with this next layer. It looks quite dark in my palette, but it will dry a lot lighter, don't worry. And I'm going to get some gamboge. Let's make a clean spot here, just so you can see what that looks like. You don't have to use both. I'm just experimenting for you so you can see what things look like. So up here is my gamboge, which is my very orangey yellow. And I want my smaller brush. I'm going to, I think I'm going right down to my number 2 brush. And I might pull out my number 4 for some of it, but I want control now. I want to control what I'm doing on these rocks. I'm going to start over here so that I don't put my hand in wet paint as I come across these rocks. So this rock has a more reddy side on the left, and it has a big shadow on the right, but I'm not going to put the big shadow in, the dark shadow in at the moment. I'm going to put my mid color on right now, my mid sort of orange. And I'm using a thirsty brush to kind of spread it out so that I have some control. And then these ones have orange as well. And I'm going to use a very dry brush for this. The front rock's maybe a bit too wet. I'm going to my gamboge just to try out the gamboge. And I'm going to kind of like stroke it, dry brush on this rock so that the brush doesn't hit all the spots of the rock. Now we get some texture. See, I'm dragging it sideways on dry paper. The brush is very dry, and I've just got gamboge on there. I'm going to grab a little bit more and drag that across the rock. Same with the already orange. I'm going to get it on my brush and then tap it off of my brush. So I have very little on there. And again, I'm going to drag some dry brush over this side to give some texture. And I'm doing this big rock here because it's big, and it gives me a chance to practice this on a bigger rock with more space. There's some little rocks down here, so I'm not going to paint them. I'm going to go into that ready orange that I mixed. And at this end of the rock, I'm going to make it a little stronger, not quite so dry brush, but I am going to dry my brush off now and bring sort of dry brush up to that dry brush here. And so I'm just drying it off. Remember, this is the second layer. This is not the final layer. This is putting a bit of color. It's darker on top. And take the point of my brush, and while it's still wet, just run a bit of color across the top. It's really good not to work wet rock against wet rock. So once I've done that one, I don't want to do the ones next to it. I can do the one up top here because it's not next to that one. So I again got my gamboge on my brush, or you could use Hazel yellow with just a touch of red added to it, just a touch. And I'm going to put that orangey yellow dry brush on this part of the rock. Get my reddish orange on, again, on a dry brush, and put it on this part of the rock. If you have, quite a dry brush, it gives you a huge amount of control on these little rocks while you're painting them. Now this one's very dark underneath, so this is the first layer of dark. It's definitely not the final layer, but I'm putting in that darker orange here, and a little bit here. Again, if you go in slow layers, you won't lose control of the paint. You can build it up slowly. So that's the rock at the top. See, when I come with this shadow underneath, I'm going to go much, much darker eventually with the shadow underneath, and even a bit darker with the shadow at the side. Can't do it all at once. These rocks are too small for that. You would everything would bleed into everything else. Then going back into my gamboge. And again, if you don't have gamboge, mix a bit of your bright orange with a little bit of bright red, just a tiny, tiny bit of bright red, and you'll get a warm orange like that. And this is a darker orange. I've just mixed more red in with my Hazel yellow. And back to the gamboge. And this end of this rock is quite yellow, so I'm putting that on there again. I'm leaving some of the light showing through because it has a lot of texture on this sandstone rock. Into my darker orange now. This side is much redder and much darker. I'm letting that bleed into that color I just put on there. And eventually underneath this rock is going to be very dark, but can't put that in yet. That has to go in on dry paint later. Now, because these rocks are your main focal point, your main feature of this painting, this is what's going to take you the time. This is not something you can just slap the paint on really quickly, even though they look just like big orange lumps. They require what's called modeling, which is a quite amount of care taken with putting the colors on. I'm going to use the raw sienna and yellow mix, a slightly dirtier brownie mix, to put the shadow on this rock. You may say, well, this one was wet. Why are you going up against it? Well, it's fairly dry now because I'm working with a dry brush. So it dries very quickly when you're working with a dry brush. And go behind this one. And I will be putting on more shadow again on this one. Pop that down there. I'm avoiding these bigger ones for the minute. I'll come back and do those later. This tree color is pretty dry. So again, I'm going to use the raw sienna and Hazel yellow mix for this one here. It has a light side, but it has a more sandy colored side too. I'm going to put that on fairly even. A little bit of the red down here. I'm just dotting the red in, just charging is what it's called. You just put a bit of the red into the sandy color and let it flow in. And up here, a little bit of the red. I'm looking at my photo. I'm looking at each rock individually to see what's happening with that rock, color-wise and value-wise. And of course, this one here is wet, so I'm going to leave that dry edge there. And just pull back. I've got my thirsty brush, which is clean and dry. I'm going to pull back a little bit of that color from that rock. That's one way you can really control your paint. I'm going to explain it on this rock here, what you can do. On this rock, I'm going to take a little bit burnt sienna to the red and yellow mix. I'll actually make another pile here. Doesn't hurt to have quite a few trays of orange and brownie orange and different oranges ready to do your rocks. And to this orangey mix, I want to add a little bit of burnt sienna just to brown it up a little bit. And I want to use that on this rock here at the edge. And I'm going to paint it just all one color like this. Nice. See, if you go up a dry edge against another rock, you're going to a nice crisp edge. Get over here so you can see better. Now, while this is wet, I'm cleaning my brush thoroughly and drying it off, making it thirsty. And I'm going to pull the color off this side of this rock, just like it is in the reference photo. This side is much lighter. Now I already have behind this red mix, I have the raw sienna and Hazel yellow mix underneath. So when I pull this red back, what I get is the Hazel yellow raw sienna color coming through, giving me a nice sandstony, soft look to the rock, but a light area and a little bit of a dark border where it comes up against this one. It's a great way to do rocks. Put your full color on and then pull some color off. Now this one up here is fairly dry, so I'm going to do that again. I'm going to do that again with this rock. Instead, I'm going to do it with that color I just used, but I'm going to add a little bit more water to it. And I'm going to put it on the whole rock. It's under this one, so it's slightly darker. We will be doing dark lines between some of the rocks so that there's definition. Now I've got that on there. This side is pretty light and I've got some masking fluid. So with my thirsty brush, I'm going to pull this side back. The brush has to be quite dry, but not completely dry. I've washed it, dried it. And I'm going to take a bit off here. The nice thing about pulling back with a thirsty brush is you get a nice crisp edge and you can pull off soft edges to the color. And it's a good reason not to use staining colors, because it's much easier to pull back a color that's non-staining. So now I've added a little bit of texture to that rock in a different way to adding the dry brush texture. It just gives some interest to the painting. This one behind here, going back to my orangey color I mixed up, and put that behind this one. Now, I know they all look sort of a bit the same at this point, but that's because we haven't got any of the dark shadows and borders in. So they're gonna look a bit sort of samey in color. And we're working here, then we're working there. It means we don't have to stop and use the hairdryer if we're working carefully. Over here is a bit more of a sandy color, so I'm going into that. I've got this sandy color is raw sienna and azo yellow, and I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to the corner of that. When you're making a puddle of color, you don't have to convert the whole puddle. You can convert the corner, and I'm going to use that for this rock back here. Put that color on. Tend to hold my breath when I'm doing some of these. And I want to get a little bit of cadmium red. And just drop that, just charge that in at the edges. Just so there's a little bit of red in at the edges, especially close to the tree. Nice to have the red against the green. And again, thirsty brush, take a little bit off the top where it's in sunlight. And that will give it a little bit of texture. We've got that one in there. That's fairly dry. We should be able to put this one in here now. Going with the raw sienna color. I can go right over the tree trunk. Remember, it's masked. Now, if I want to get the grass along the edge of this rock, I can just wet where the grass is and pull the color down into that wet area, and I will have kind of a fuzzy edge that will be good as a grass edge to that. I'm back into my brownie red, and I want to charge some brownie red in there. And you can see as that comes down into the wet area, it makes sort of a fuzzy grass edge to the edge of the rock. It makes it sort of sit down in the grass. There will be some much darker definition behind that rock later. And I'm going to pull a little bit of light off the top with my thirsty brush. Kind of slopes down like this. Just pull that down. And slowly, slowly, I know it takes a while, slowly, slowly, we're building up these rocks. And I apologize that it takes so long to do that. However, time, it's going to take us a good deal of time. But that's the way it goes with something like this. It's a little bit at a time, slowly, slowly, and you gradually get your definition. I'll put a little bit more red on the edge of this one and the edge of this one. I think I can definitely got some time to put a bit more over here. This one's fairly dry now. And I'll be using some darker paint to really sort of show up some of the edges. Go in here with the slightly darker raw sienna brown. And we got this big one up here that's very raw sienna-y on the top, dry brush. and very brown sort of area down here, and much more like burnt sienna. Got some burnt sienna color for down this edge of the rocks, much darker. And you can see as I start to put in the slightly darker colors, you can see more 3-dimension to the rocks. A little bit of that up here. It's on my red color brush. It has to be using your brush to kind of scrape some texture into these rocks. Put this little one in. Some of them are so small, you can just put in some color and put on some texture later on. And some shadow. We just got this big one and a couple here. Get my red color. I'm going to wet that area where the grass is again. So if I wet this, then when my color comes down behind here, it will come down into wet paint where it will form kind of grass as it comes down into the wet paint. You can see it makes a soft border. Pull a little bit of that color off the top of the rock. And wet, I think. Just check that I wet across here to make grass. Come behind here with a few rocks just coming down into the grass. We have one more rock here to put in. And I like the gamboge for these big ones because they're really focal points. A nice and sort of yellowy color on this side, leaving some light, and then going into our. I'm going to add some cadmium red to that gamboge to get a really nice reddy orange for this part of the rock. Leaving some highlights. Behind these rocks are some really dark rocks that I'll put in. And as soon as these are all dry, put that in. Some dark here. And I've got to think about how much I've got done now. I don't like this shape that I made here. I might pull back some of the shape with a wet brush and modify that. I don't like what happened there at all. Oh, we've got to that stage. I really got to a stage now where I'm going to dry all of this. I'm going to pour. Oh, I think the best thing to work on now is the shadows on the rocks. We want to use a nice reddish brown for that. And I have quite a lot of different reds here. So I have here, I have one here that's mixed. I've now got yellow all over my hand. So this one is red with burnt sienna. So I'm going to use some of those colors for the dark brown. First of all, I want the burnt sienna. And I want to warm that up with a little bit of cadmium red. We have a lovely warm burnt sienna. And added to that some ultramarine blue. So we've got the color of the rocks, the color we're using, but we're darkening them up with some ultramarine blue. You could use phthalo blue too. It just might make it go a bit dark, and ultramarine blue is easier to wash back is very strong and difficult to wash back. I want my number 2 brush. I want a lot of control for the shadows. And I might have done another layer of dry brush and color, but I don't want to take too long with today's demos. But if you're feeling like your rocks are too pale, it's going to get some cadmium red and a little bit of azo yellow, make a nice strong orange. And I might have done on some of them a little bit more dry brush. It's not quite dry enough. Quite a bit more, just to give it a bit more color, especially some of these. But that's, you know, that's your choice. And I don't think we have enough time to do too much of that. Just put a little bit of dry brush on. But certainly if you want to, you can. And there's one thing I don't like. I just want to see if I can fix a little bit. I do not like what happened to my tree here. I want to see if I can pull some of that out and maybe put some rock in there if I can get some of that out of there. I have a little scrubbing brush and a Kleenex. And I just feel that that was a horrible shape in there that I created. I've got this little scrubbing brush and clean water Kleenex, a little bit of a scrub and a dab. And I think I'm going to try and create, when that's dry, I can't do it while that's damp like that, but when that's dry, I'm going to create another little rock in there. It will disappear and put a brownie orange on it, and that will solve that little problem that I don't like. So I have that brownie color, nice brownie color that I've mixed up. Need my number 2 brush. And let's start with some of the shadows. Leave my reference photo in front of me. The first shadow we have here is a cast shadow from this rock right here. I want to put that on. And we have to be fairly bold. It looks scary to put the darks on, but they have to be there. And under the rock is fairly dark, and there's a crack on the side. Now, just under the rock, I've let a little bit of the paint come off my brush onto my towel, so it's not quite so dark as this shadow. And there's a, now I'm going to add a little bit of water to that dark and a little bit of blue. And behind these rocks are some darker rocks in the background. Kind of back here. So if you put those in, it kind of defines the shape of the foreground rocks. And you can actually put with a very fine brush, you can put the shadow line between these rocks here. It's thicker on this edge, and then it goes very thin up here. There's sort of 3 little rocks on top of this rock. And I've kind of broken the line a little bit. It gets thinner as it comes up to the top. There's this rock here. I'm going to go into my brown, my reddy brown, and I'm going to put a more reddy brown color on the edge of that rock there. Not quite so dark. And I also want to go into my orangey, we get a little bit of brown with that, orangey brown mix dry brush, and put some texture on the bottom of this rock here and that one. And there's definitely, I've got my orange here. Add some burnt sienna to that. I'm sorry, you can't see. Dry that off a bit. Browny green. And now I've got to get some darker texture in here. A bit of a dry brush. It's not as dark as the shadow color. It has a little bit of the orange mixed in it, and I can also add a little bit of blue just to, so it's not as dark as the shadow, but we're still adding a bit of dry brush shadow, especially like here, dry brush shadow here and here. It's like I said, it's a slow process here. Dragging my dry brush sideways, but underneath this rock, coming up against these boulders underneath, is a definite shadow. And you have to be bold with the shadows. It feels scary, I know, but otherwise nothing shows up. Nothing looks three-dimensional if you don't get a bit bold with these shadows. This rock has shadow here. And underneath. You're working a lot of the time light against dark, so you want to see the light edge of the rock in front, and then the shadow and the dark of the rock behind. And these little rocks underneath this one, they show up quite light. And then the shadow behind them, pretty dark. And the shadow at this end too. And it doesn't all sort of blend together and look right until you get them all in. I'm going to put a little bit of shadow on this rock and some around here. Now, because there was a couple of trees here, I've created a bit more in the way of rocks instead of those trees, because I don't want those trees in there. It was just too much fiddly stuff. I'm going back into my dark brown, and let's go up to this top rock here. So along this edge, looking very carefully at the shape of the shadow. And it's darker over this side. And then it lightens up, so I can get a wet brush and I can pull that over here with just a wet brush, so it's not quite so dark on this side. A little bit of shadow here, and dry brush, a little bit of shadow, more shadow up here. My dry brush drags sideways. Get a little bit of ultramarine blue on my brush, just ultramarine blue, and I'm going to charge it into that shadow underneath to make it even darker. Blue, remember, a complement of orange, so it's going to do a great job of the shadows for you. I want this one nice and strong up here to make it look three-dimensional. The shadow over here, not quite so strong. I'm going to put some on and wipe it off. I'll put some on and wipe my brush and wipe some of it off. But as it comes under here, it gets stronger. Under here, coming up to the edge here, much, much darker. Behind this one. Dry brush again. I'm going to add a bit more texture, dry brush texture here. So there's slight shadows, but not obscuring all the light. And then I'm going to go with that ultramarine blue, because I want to charge in just a little bit of ultramarine blue to have that complementary shadow really getting in there between the rocks. Now this one has not got much color on, so I want to add, I'm going to add some orange. Add a bit more orange dry brush to this one. It needs more color before I go in with any dark. Don't want to touch that dark up here. I'm not touching my brush to that. I got to really control what I'm doing. And a bit more orange on this one too. And you build, build, build. So while all those are sort of drying, I'm going to put some shadow on this side and up this side of the rock, back here. And I'm going to do that, wetting this area so that we've got like the soft grass at the bottom of the shadow. And then taking my wet brush and also just softening that shadow a little bit with my wet brush, so it's not so harsh. And there's a little bit of shadow behind this one too. It's not quite as dark as the other shadow. And take that in, use a wet brush to soften that shadow in, not as harsh. This one is fairly harsh. There's some cracks in the rock. So now I've sort of softened it in with a wet brush. I can go in and put a little bit more definition. Remembering that just to wet this so that we have the soft grass coming around the rock at the base here. And I'm going to put the shadow in on this rock, just in there. Always wetting the grass so you get that soft transition. Now up here where I made this horrible mess, I'm going to try and turn that into another rock if I can. It'll take a few stages. I'm going to put a bit of raw sienna mix in, and then I'm going to get some of the orangey cadmium red mix. The red should help obscure the green that was in there. It will look like a bit of a mess at the moment, but I will work with it and hopefully get it to blend in eventually. Have some of that red on my brush. So I'm going to put a bit of dry brush red on these, a bit more on this one. You can see like a little bit here, a little bit there. Slowly, slowly, you build up the shapes of the rocks and the shadows. I have to stop and think from time to time. The shadow behind this one's really subtle, very, very subtle. So I'm just going to bring a little line of dark down and use my wet brush to just, actually going to get a little bit of orange on my brush so it's not too brown. Just drag that in with a wet brush. There's a little bit of shadow on that side too. Drag that in, just so that the rocks have to have a bit of an edge to them. And the dry grass, and the dry grass has wet paint to keep it. And bring this shadow down into that wet grass I just wet. And on. This is quite a slow process. If you rush this part, your rocks won't look like rocks, I promise you. They will just sort of look like blobs. So this part takes quite a bit of patience and time, and we'll probably have to stop before we're completely finished these, but it's a good thing to leave them for a couple of hours and go back either in a couple of hours or tomorrow and have another look at them, and maybe put, when it's really nice and dry, the paper, put a bit more definition on, because it really helps if the paper's super nice and dry before you do that. So we'll leave those for a minute because I just want to work on the foreground here, putting in a bit of extra interest in the foreground, and definitely some of the darks that go in there. Now I feel like the foreground, now that the red and everything is dried, it's still very pale because red fades so much. So I'm going to get some burnt sienna and some cadmium red, and I wet this area, and I'm just going to put in a bit more color in the foreground with the cadmium red and burnt sienna. Just here. It gets lighter as it goes on. A little bit there. It looks quite bright on the camera, but believe me, as it dries, it really lightens up. I want to put a bit more grass in this area, some darks, but I want it wet because I don't want it to be too stark, too prominent. I want it to be soft So soft grass. I'm just wetting this area. I'm getting a very small brush, probably my my little rigger brush, and some. I have this browny green. I'm going to add a little bit more sap green to it. It's a browny green already. It's a very browny green now, and there's some. I'm going to add some streaks. Add a little bit of ultramarine blue to that too. And some burnt sienna to get a really browny green color. I want to add a bit of that grass along here. And if I just drag that through that wet paper, it'll give me grass all by itself. Just make it. And then it won't be too in your face kind of stuff. There's some definite dark shadows here. And I've made a really dark color with burnt sienna, ultramarine, and a bit of sap green, or any green, sort of earthy green that you have. On this corner, I've got my rigger brush, and I'm bringing in some dry grass. So I'm back here. Of course, back here is going to be much lighter, so I'm going to take that out for a minute. Definitely want to be definitely around the base of the tree. Some nice warm. I'm going to add some of that reddy brown color grass here. I've got the reddy brown now. My brush, put some of that in here. Back to the dark one, and I'm going to come in on this corner. Remember, the paper's wet, so it's not going to be really definite. I'll give you a sense of some grass here. I'll bring a little bit in this corner, some horizontal streaks. Some here, a little bit here. Especially, you need to get, as well as this, the streaks of grass coming up, you also need to have the horizontal in there to make your landscape lay down. So it's okay to have this grass coming up, but have it coming up from some horizontal shading. It doesn't have to be super precise. That's okay. And you don't want to overdo it either. Like back here, I want a very gentle green. I'm going to mix some ultramarine blue with a little bit of Hazel yellow and some water. So that back here, I've got some very gentle green, because you need the blue greens, the gentle colors to go into the background. So I'm here. And we're working wet in wet. Make sure you have some of your lights, your definite lights showing. And some darks. Lovely to have some darks, but not all over. Need to really, and of course, as these rocks dry, I can add more darks to them too. But they have to be really dry to get the darks in well. I'm going to bring this. These are still wet, but I'll show you how I'm going to work that rock in there that was actually a tree. I didn't like what I'd done with that, so I'm turning it into a rock. These ones here are much too light. Let me go to my number 1 brush. These are too light, so I've got to come back here and put a bit more shading in them, just to make them lay down. And even over here, even if these rocks don't have that much shadow under them, I'm going to put a little bit more just to make them lay down too. And put a little bit of dark across there. Now the wet in wet is really great for the foreground. This tree is looking awful. This bush back here, don't like it at all. But I don't give up. I just continue to scrub out, put something in, scrub something out, put something in until it looks okay. So I think I'll scrub out a bit of foliage. And when that's dry, put a bit more dark foliage in, and I'll have, it's looking better already. So I'm scrubbing out some light foliage, and I'll put a bit more dark foliage in later, and that will be just fine. It will be okay. Only you will ever know about it. I want to just pause and dry and just do the final touches on the tree. And then for now, this will sort of be finished, although I would, if I were you, go back and put in a few dark details later when it's really, really dry. So the last step I want to do is to erase the masking fluid from the tree trunk and work on that a little bit because it's a little bit too bare, just like that. Let's get my, it's got to have some shading and some brown on there. So we've got the masking fluid off. Oh, tell you what, I've also got masking fluid on. I put some on the rocks up here so that they would have highlights, so I wouldn't lose some of the highlights. I got to get that off too. It's always a good idea if you really feel that you might lose your highlights, put just a tab of masking fluid on. It's hard stuff to control, so try not to use it too much. And of course, I have my bleed proof white, which I can also use if I feel like I need to, if I feel like I have some, I could have a few extra branches here and there that need to be more delicate, because you can't get delicate with the masking fluid. It's awful stuff. So I'm just using that PH Martin's white and maybe even some grass. Here's some lighter grass with it. You can mix it with your watercolor paints too if you want to mix it with some raw sienna to get some lighter grass here, you can. And if you've lost some highlights on your rocks, you can put a few in with your white paint. Always handy in that respect. But the rocks need, not the rocks, the tree trunk needs a little bit more work. It needs some brown. It has some mottled brown on it. So we can use anything from the tray. I've got this dark brown for the rocks. I can mix a little bit of extra burnt sienna in with that. And the base of the trunk has sort of mottled brown on it. My actual reference photo is blown to the ground with my hairdryer, so I'm using my painting to help me just sort of work on these little areas on the tree trunk. Kind of goes a little bit darker up here. Well, that just gives it a little bit of texture on the trunk. And I've got a lighter brown as well. Some of these branches going away into the tree are a slightly lighter brown color. They're in shadow. And they're not all totally white. I don't know what kind of tree it is. And up here, I might want to put a little bit of darker green in. So I have that brown mix in front of me, and I'm just going to add a bit of sap green to it. I could mix up any dark green. I could use ultramarine with yellow and some burnt sienna. I could use almost any dark green. If you mix some burnt sienna and ultramarine into any green, you can darken it up. So I just wanted to darken that up a little bit. And just here too, put a little bit more going on over here with this bush that I didn't do a very good job with. Mostly because it's a weird little bush in the background. I'm not too keen on it, but don't really know what else to put in there. I will. A few more little dark leaves, maybe a few more branches. And we're just about done for this little picture. And like I say, I think you should put a few more shadows on when it's when it's really dry if you feel it needs it. And don't forget your corners to have a bit more in the corners so that you keep your eye focused on the middle of your painting. I always like to at least take the tape off so you can have a look at it clean before we go, or before we chat about how you did. You're all still there. Hold on to the corners, they can rip on you easily. So there we go. It's never my best effort when I'm trying to talk and demonstrate and get it done in a limited amount of time. But
so thank you for joining us for that watercolor lesson. I hope your painting turned out well, and I apologize for the abrupt ending there. We were on a Zoom call, a Zoom lesson, so we wanted to stop and chat and share our paintings with each other. So I'll see you next time, and take care. Bye for now.